Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. This is my first in-person discussion since February 2020 when the pandemic hit, and so I'm very pleased to be sharing space in a non-virtual manner, but also to everyone on the live stream and watching this on YouTube, thank you as well for engaging. Wherever an audience can be found, I feel is necessary, important, and exciting. So today I want to discuss briefly, before we get into the question and answer with Molly, well, first I want to thank the organizers of this event. Thank you so much to Rachel for inviting me, to the Oxford Union, to President Adam, to Molly, who will be doing the Q&A, and to everyone who's in attendance. But I want to talk a bit about this past year we've had, particularly as it relates to anti-racism, intersectionality, and anti-oppression work. It has felt as though so many people are listening, are more aware of this necessary conversation of racism. But this issue is not new. Race is older than America. Of course, Oxford is older than race. And so when we think about it this way, it's very important for us to understand that race is not something that is naturally occurring. It has been disguised through our skin. It has been disguised as our differences. But it is just that, an invention, a lie created in order to fulfill the prophecies of Enlightenment era scholars and scientists that was self-benefiting and self-fulfilling. To define what it meant to be a human being relative to a Western European man, but then to also be a Western European man, creates this insidious link toward what it means to look at race, what it means to discuss human rights, when the people who are defined as human do not look like me, do not look like most of us in this room, and yet it is framed as something that we can attain if we just dress properly, or speak properly, or behave properly, or wear our hair properly, when in fact, it is important to remember that these constructs were never meant to include us, and their exclusion of us is the very essence of what it means to be human in Euro-colonial contexts, or in the Western world. I say Euro-colonial because Western is geographically relative. For the indigenous people of Turtle Island, colonizers came from the East. Where I'm from in Los Angeles, the West is the East. And so we have to name these things appropriately. But I want to take you back to 1500, when the Enlightenment era scholars began using religion in addition to philosophy and in addition to science to define what it meant to be a human being and what race was and what race meant. And I'll be reading you a few excerpts from my yet unpublished book, Read This to Get Smarter. So, in 1513 through 1604 AD, Spain, Britain, and France continued to invade North America, and the first enslaved Africans were brought to what became the United States, to the British colonies. Well, in 1662, partus sequitur ventrum, you have to excuse my Latin there, or the offspring follows from the belly, became law in Virginia. And this extended the status of enslavement and chattel slavery from mother to child, which first codified the human reproductive aspect of the social reproduction of race. When we look at social reproduction, we have to think of these constructs. We build these things, and let's be honest, when I say we, it's not me, it's these long-dead European colonizers, created these constructs and then created the scripts for how those constructs were meant to be duplicated onto one another, racializing each other, policing each other, gendering each other, placing us into these boxes. That's called social reproduction. But there's also the human reproduction aspect of it. And so we see that in 1662. In 1664, a law was passed in the British colony. The Maryland General Assembly used two legal criteria, which included a black skin and a residency in Maryland, to interconnect the condition of enslavement with racialized blackness in the law. This codified the belief that all black people, enslaved or free, were designated as enslaved, and it also served to provide the basis for holding black Christians in perpetual bondage. In 1675, a coalition formed between the poorest people in the British colonies to enslave and try to colonize the indigenous people, And swiftly, there were anti-miscegenation laws to further codify race and to further codify that human reproductive aspect of race, to define what and who could reproduce and what that meant for whom. And then we get the Code Noir Decree in 1685, which defines the livelihood and the ways that people are allowed to live and not, and the human rights that they have access to and that they are denied according to race. King Louis XIV created the Code Noir Decree to control free and enslaved Black people in the French territories of the Americas. The code required the indoctrination of enslaved Black people into Christianity and limited the civil and citizenship rights of freed Black people. For example, people of European and racialized parentage could not use their European parents' last name. What does that serve? Denying legacy, denying access to that Euro-colonial construct of humanity, whether or not you were racially passing or not, placing these restrictions on people. We do not get to the murder of George Floyd, of Breonna Taylor, of Alton Sterling, of Sandra Bland, of the countless named and unnamed Black people at the hands of a police state, of a Euro-colonial police state, without understanding these 100-year-old decrees and doctrines that define what racialized Blackness meant and what that power meant when it was given and denied accordingly. In 1691, white first appeared in the law. Prior to this, white people didn't exist. Quite literally, the invention of white people had not yet come to pass until 1691, centuries after the first enslaved Black people were brought from Africa. And why did they become existent within the law? To define that white people in the Virginia colony, who, as we remember, formed an alliance with the freed Black people to form an alliance against the indigenous people, furthering the ways that we codify and socially reproduce race to deny access and power and land. To ban intermarriage between Black and white people is why we get the definition of whiteness. And we see this as recently as, I believe, 1949, with the definition of whiteness as it related to apartheid in South Africa. These things are so immediately connected. And it begins the long history of anti-miscegenation laws, not only in the United States, but globally. And that takes me to the scientific study of human variation. Because in 1749, and you're going to enjoy this, maybe as much as I do. But French naturalist and scientific racist, that was his job, Georges Louis Leclerc introduced race and racism into the scientific study of human variation. And this is where we see things get completely off of the rails. In 1758, Swedish botanist and scientific racist Carl Linnaeus, you may have heard of him, classifies human beings into 6 variations, not 4, as we often hear about, those 4 being Homo sapiens asiaticus, yellow people, Homo sapiens americanus, red people, Homo sapiens europaeus, white people, Homo sapiens africanus, Black people. Well, the other 2 that are often removed from history textbooks that try to legitimize what Carl Linnaeus tried to legitimize is Homo sapiens ferus, wild people, and Homo sapiens monstrossus, monster people, which was a catch-all for everything else that he had not yet come to encounter and designate as lesser to Europeans. But when we hide the ridiculousness behind these designations, Carl Linnaeus didn't go and colonize land. He hired mercenaries to go and inspect the people and then defined everything from their hair color, skin color, body features, hair texture, eye color, behavior, form of government, and clothing as lesser to Europeans. How convenient that he also happened to be European, and how convenient that we still define things like primitivism and civilization and modernity according to these scripts. And then in 1787, we get Christophe Meniers, who publishes Outline of the Theory and History of the Beautiful Sciences, which advances harmful ideologies like the superior beauty, intelligence, and brain size of Europeans. He also happened to be European, coincidentally, including over all racialized people, including indigenous people in the Americas and Africa, Jewish peoples, Slavic peoples, and Meniere's claims that racialized people, especially Black people, feel less pain and experience less emotions than white people. You may have seen the op-ed written by Serena Williams talking about how she couldn't get access to quality maternal health care, or the fact that in the United States, maternal mortality rates are worse than in exploited and recovering countries that are getting back to their status from prior to colonization. That is because of what racist scientist Christophe Meniere said in 1787. Like I said, we do not get to this current state without looking back at the history and looking at these scripts created through the assumptions and self-fulfilling prophecies and self-benefiting prophecies of these people that we still look to. Immanuel Kant. We look to Darwin. Let me get to Darwin. And then we get folks like Blumenbach, people who were just very much intent on defining humanity relative to what benefited them. We also get this fun little Easter egg. In America, we often talk about the founding fathers. We go on about it. And one founding father, Benjamin Rush, he was a physician and a noted racist, proposed the idea of Negroidism. Get this, a non-existent medical condition, form of leprosy, that was the reason why racialized people had darker skin. He advanced the idea, and you can read his papers. He was very proud. He wrote several pamphlets on it. It's available in the Library of Congress, saying, in fact, that darker-skinned people were actually white-skinned and in need of sympathy and medical treatment, not scorn and malice. In 1799, that was the cutting-edge white moderate, white liberal, who was not condemning racism, but just redefining it in a way that made them feel more content with treating people less than human. Rush is also known for signing the Declaration of Independence. When we get to 1865, and chattel slavery being abolished in the United States, except for a punishment as a crime, which is why in the United States, people who are incarcerated are still forced to work and can only make up to $1.15 US. And the Bureau of Prisons hails this as good for the economy because incarcerated people only see about 4 cents of every dollar that they generate. But don't worry, they only see 2 cents of that every dollar because that other 2 cents go to pay debts that also benefit this system. We don't get here without looking back at the history and seeing where we came from. And I'll leave you with Darwin. In 1872, English biologist, naturalist, and racist Charles Darwin publishes The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, and claims that human species consist of separate biological races, and that variations in skin tone, hair texture, facial features, and more are evidence of this. Darwin suggests that biological race has been created either through sexual selection or natural selection. He wasn't quite sure. He also asserts that when biologically distinct races reproduce or mix, they form new distinct races. And from this, we get the idea of mixed race people. Because if race is an invention, and race is an invention created to create the possibility of race, not to define race itself, but to create the possibility of difference, and that difference is not neutral, but bad and something to be scorned and looked down upon, then what does it mean when we miscegenate or reproduce and commit that human reproduction of the social reproduction of race? It's a negotiation of power. It's looking at the dynamics of how humanity has been defined relative to Eurocolonialism. This whole past 500, 600 years has been a slow implementation of race. But we do not get from looking at this as an exercise and then looking at the world around us in terms of race and then get to freedom in the next step. I read a book at the beginning of the pandemic called Colorblind. A White Woman Looks at the Negro. It's by Margaret Halsey. I read it as a joke. I went to a thrift store, got the book, and they were so embarrassed that they had it on offer that they gave it to me for free. So awesome. But as I was reading this book, I expected to laugh. I expected to laugh at this woman and how liberal and woke she thought that she was. only to realize that she's saying a lot of the same things that we say today. Of course, she was a lot worse. It was like 1940. She would say things like, for many Negroes, the white man is the white, a monolith, something to be feared, something that is all the same. And for the white, Negroes are the Negro, a monolith, something to be feared. And then in the next breath, she says, but Negro hysteria about race is a little much. And it's like, okay, Margaret, reel it in. But when we look at these things, at the end of the book, she says, how do we solve race? The Negro question. Even though, did we create this? No. Hire Black speakers. Bring Black people to your spaces. Integrate your schools. Not just one student, but not more than 3. Because it's too much pressure for one student, but more than 3 is a little bit much. Find out which Black organizations you can support. Don't give them too many donations as you would a white organization. You don't want to overwhelm them with resources. And the countless other things that were posted on those Google Drive links that were circulated on cards and on bit.ly links. What has changed? Certainly the language, but in 100 years or less than 100 years, in 80 years, we've been doing the same thing as it relates to race. We've been walking around acting as if it exists, acting as if physical characteristics and ancestry define race, when no, it is invention, it is politics, it is body politics, it is toxic, it is based on assumptions, and it has deadly consequences. And we see this countless times. And every time there is a flashpoint of violence, we do the same things. So what's the solution? I propose that one of the biggest solutions when it comes to looking at race is to look inward. It's the more uncomfortable thing to do. It's the more abstract thing to do. But if we're to look at institutional racism and interpersonal racism, then we must look at the intrapersonal racism, because it is our beliefs about ourselves, whether that's about our inferiority or superiority to other people based on these myths of race, that allow us to participate in interpersonal racism and institutional racism and turn an unseeing eye to people being killed. To look over across the water and see what's going on in America and say, how dare they? When meanwhile, the disproportionate rates of Black people who are incarcerated in the UK is egregious and often turned away from in favor of looking at racism elsewhere. We want to create faraway solutions for faraway problems when in fact, we contribute. And so I leave you with that meditation as we go into the Q&A. And I thank you so much for having me, Oxford Union. Thank you.
Blair, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for that fantastic speech. I'm keen to leave time for the audience questions at the end, so please do get thinking if there's anything you'd like to ask. But let's start at the beginning. Could you tell us a bit about what led you to get into this area of history, and then how that became activism and campaigning?
Definitely. I think it's a little bit of the reverse. It started out as a lot of activism, as a lot of campaigning, as you said. And then when I realized how unsustainable that way of living was, and I'll make it less abstract. Growing up, I had always really idolized Angela Davis. She was like the one person in history that I could identify with visually, but also her ethos. My uncle Craig had giant posters that said "Free Angela" my whole childhood, and she was bigger than a person to me. And my friend Jamia Wilson, her mother would say that we all want to be Angela Davis, but our version of Angela Davis. And I think that's so resonant because when it comes to role models, we're not copying them, we're trying to find ourselves through them. And that was the case for me. But what I wasn't attuned to was how unsustainable so much of the trauma that she went through was. Because that's not what we want to hear. We want to hear, people who are taking the system down, but not facing the consequences. People who are shattering glass ceilings, but not looking at where those shards fall. And that's what I started to experience. My partner, Akeem, and I were arrested in Baton Rouge, Louisiana during the protests, following the murder of Alton Sterling. And following that very public traumatic event that I was supposed to be very proud of, I couldn't be around sirens. I had a hard time being around crowds. It became psychologically, it was difficult. And I wasn't aware of all the warning signs that my family had given me. My father briefly mentioned being in the movement, but was never able to discuss it. And I was so confused, like, why would you not be proud of it? But it's not a lack of pride, it's trauma. And so the way that I retired from being an organizer was to become a historian more full-time. But it's just as riveting to me because I think that while it's all necessary, right? We have to have an approach that's multi-pronged. And if we're going to be burning ourselves out time and time again, that we don't have any longevity. And I think looking at history is one of the best ways to build longevity, because we can literally look and be like, oh, wow, we were going through this in 1943. Okay, well, if nothing has changed, maybe we should re-strategize. And sometimes it takes looking in awkward places, but I also have to say, so much thanks to my colleague and mentor, Dr. Shea McLean, whose entire thesis is on this subject matter, and looking at the intersections of biology and physiology and race and evolutionary genetics was something that I felt was so far over my head, but it sits so comfortably within race and within history. And I really feel like it's the path forward. It's bizarre. Looking backward is the path forward, but we can't face ourselves unless we know who we are.
And you've created the viral series Smarter in Seconds. How do you think that the new mediums of social media have allowed you to sort of disseminate information in a different way? Do you think that creating these few seconds long videos is a sort of a compromise to get information out there, or is it just as good as a big history book?
I think it's really worthwhile. And my mentor, Miss Sadie Roberts-Joseph, she was my mentor when I worked at a museum. When I was going to school at Louisiana State University, to graduate, I had to take an independent study course. And this independent study course had to be my degree program, which was Reconstruction era, so right after enslavement. So my capstone class was either a bunch of essays and archiving or doing an unpaid internship at a plantation as a Black person. So I said no, and I was able to create a new internship program at the African American Museum. And Dr. Stater at LSU was absolutely so accommodating. I basically presented that conundrum to him, and he was like, looking forward to your alternatives. But Miss Sadie taught me that it doesn't matter how many degrees you have or how prestigious your school is. If you cannot make plain what you are talking about to the people back at home, it doesn't matter. Because there's such a violence and such a politics around making education inaccessible. Jargon is violence. To say, oh, how dare you not know about this? And you can't even give me a simple definition of the word without reciting your word. It's problematic. And so I think that it's not at all a compromise to make things more simplistic. It really shows you how good is this theory if you can't explain it. What does it matter? And so with Smarter in Seconds, it really started out with Instagram Reels, the 30-second, it was 15-second format. Thank God they expanded it to 30. And I was like, okay, well, I'm not gonna sing and dance. I'm not gonna do my makeup on Reels, but I can talk really fast. And so let me put that to good use. And I started doing lessons on pronouns and like Black American versus African American, and surprise, surprise, just call people what they wanna be called. And it has expanded to me working with Dr. Moya Bailey on misogynoir, the combination of anti-Blackness and misogyny. And her concepts are graspable like that because they are important. And I feel if something is important, it doesn't mean it has to be inaccessible. And I think that it's actually the reverse. If something is more accessible, it's almost more worthwhile because people can cling to it more. And the unfortunate thing is that I think that people who are very intent on white supremacy and Eurocolonialism are excellent at sound bites. Britain first. Make America great again. And here we are with jumbling our words together. And so I think that we have to meet people where they're at. People have increasingly short attention spans because our media is increasingly short. And I grew up with very high color media. we respond to that. I grew up with Sesame Street. Well, that seems to work. Why don't we also teach young people about systems of oppression instead of just, you might feel sad sometimes. You might feel sad sometimes, and it's likely because systems of oppression have caused you to feel that you should doubt yourself, even though you know exactly who you are. That's a lot more fulfilling, and I think it's very achievable, but we get very caught up in the taboo of subject matter, and we neglect to step into that discomfort and sort it out.
And what inspired you to create Equality for Her? And can you talk a bit about the impact that you think the organization has had so far?
Thank you. So back in college, when I first learned, so Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw came and spoke at LSU, and she gave like meaning to my experience, intersectionality, not only the identities we embody, but also as they relate to systems of oppression, whether those harm us or benefit us. I think the and benefit us is also an important bit, because you can be harmed by something but also benefit from another aspect of it, like sexism. I suffer from sexism because I'm a woman, but I benefit from cis sexism because I'm cisgender. I was assigned woman at birth and I identify as a woman. And so if we're looking at one dimension of that, people are being removed from the table. Anyway, so Dr. Crenshaw came and she spoke about this, and I wanted so desperately to have a feminist organization on campus. And even though this was a big school of 35,000 people, we felt that having one, we felt that having one feminist organization on campus was sufficient. And at the same time, there was a running group that came called Soul Sisters, great branding. They would be running together, we love, Soul Sisters, Soul Sisters. And then there was this caveat added that was very transphobic, of real women only. And that felt so wrong. It is so wrong, because you don't fight sexism by gatekeeping. You don't fight for women's equality by defining who we are based on our genitalia. That's literally anti-sex, that's literally anti-feminist. And so I wanted to do that, but then I felt there were so many roadblocks in my way. And so I eventually was pushed out of doing an on-campus thing. And sometimes, especially in Islam, believe that when one door closes, it's just because there's better plans in your way. Sometimes it's very inconvenient. You try to beat on that door a bunch of times, but you really have to pivot. And so I started working with folks internationally. And I think this is something that's really taken off, like coalition building internationally through the internet. Using infographics to educate was something that we pioneered with Equality for Her. And that's taken off almost too much. And so it was just really exciting. And so while we're defunct now, we closed, I think 2 years ago. It's really been interesting to see that a lot of things I was like trying to do with like less resources than other organizations are what I'm now doing. Like my whole premise of Read This to Get Smarter are lessons that I worked with people on. That's how I met Dr. Shea Akil McLean before he got his PhD, working on a lesson about bathrooms. He had done a Twitter thread about the issue of power, not bathrooms. It's not really about who can pee where. It's actually about power and denying people humanity and autonomy. And we did a video and we worked on that together. And then it just became about how do we get to this concision where somebody is interested enough to click on something and we capture their attention and we teach them something new where they want to take that step further. So it's really evolved. But I think starting a nonprofit, I don't know how old I was, it was 2014. That was a lesson in coalition building and what it means to really like have this layer of prestige, because Equality for Her sounded like we've been around since the 80s, but we'd actually been around since 2014. And so how do I rise to the occasion and fake it till I become it, but also recognize that I only feel like I'm faking it because imposter syndrome is more about how systems of oppression deny us the feeling of deserving being somewhere, not that we actually don't deserve to be there.
And you wrote Modern HERstory. Can you talk a bit more about how we teach history and look back alongside campaigning and looking at our world today? And like you said about the media, what changes can we make to the media and the way that we're presenting things specifically to educate people better?
I think one of the interesting things with Modern HERstory, so that was my first book, and LeVar Burton, he was in Roots, he was on Reading Rainbow, I hope y'all know, LeVar Burton's amazing. He shouted me out on Twitter, and I was doing a fundraising campaign to get my book published, and he said, somebody published this woman's book, and like the entire publishing world, it felt like was in my DMs the next day. And it was really such a blessing, and I really credit him with me being an author even to begin with, because I never thought that I would be an author. Now I'm on my third book, and it's such a blessing, but it's also such a responsibility. And the interesting thing is, in 2018, doing things like featuring Little Miss Flint, who had written a letter to President Obama, challenging him to bear witness to the crisis in Flint, Michigan, and still seeing her campaign about this. Back then it was like, child activists? What are we talking about? And you're having Malala and Greta Thunberg here soon. The dynamic has shifted, and yet marginalized people are sometimes still left out of the equation, even as we start to transform that. And so featuring folks like Rokhaya Diallo, who is a presenter on BBC, who's an amazing activist, and seeing how she keeps pointing back to these conversations she was having previously. Oh no, we talked about this. We talked about this, but it's just been in this past year where that interest has come about. And so while it is immensely frustrating and infuriating it sometimes to feel as though, yes, we've been trying to have this conversation for quite a while, and to just be allowed into the room. You're grateful you're there, but at the same time, it's like, whew, you know, where have you been? And so I think Modern HERstory is kind of a testament to that. I wanted to feature so many people who were doing such amazing work. But even as I got to this like very elusive place of the publishing industry, I was asked, we had 17 rejections for the book. I was being asked, why aren't there many white women featured? And I was like, there's 4. In a time where so many of the books had 60 white women and 4 Black women. And that's diversity. And even when I got the offer for the book with my editor, Caitlin Ketchum, she said, what makes your book different? And I said, you talk a lot about diversity, but unfortunately, all of these books are written by white people. And then I felt I was never going to hear back from her. And luckily, she took that as a challenge to look at that intrapersonal racism and how it contributes to that institutional racism, and invited me to write my 3rd book now. But I think with Modern HERstory, it's so much about telling these stories on people's terms presently, because we look at folks like Lorraine Hansberry, who is remembered, posthumously as a lesbian, despite the fact she was married to a man. And perhaps she would have described herself as bisexual. Perhaps she wouldn't. Perhaps she wouldn't have described herself or come out at all, because that's not actually necessary to be validly queer or accepted as part of the community. But retrospectively, we look at people and we say, you must define yourself this way. And we have to have room for gray area. We have to honor our ancestors on their terms. And so why wait for people to become ancestors? Why not honor them on their terms while they're still here, and not be concerned about what else they might achieve in 2 years after this book is published, or 3 years, and instead be excited that that's an inevitability, and be, content to capture that moment in time, and then hope that growth manifests from there, and use those stories as lessons. And the last thing I'll say about it is that I think it's so important to tell people as evolving stories, because we're all evolving stories. And I think it's important that we show how people got from childhood to where they are today very plainly, not just these myths of, I tried really hard and it worked out, but I used this, I went to this class, I networked with these people, so that people can duplicate that. Because it is also, I believe, violent when we use history in a way to suppress people, to say, unless you feel as though you can walk the line of Dr. King, don't try. But instead to look at it as, actually, a lot of planning went into this, and a lot of people contributed their weekends, their evenings, and you can do that too with determination and dedication. But that's a lot more threatening to any system of oppression, to actually give people the tools that they need to dismantle those systems of oppression.
And as someone who's Black, queer, and Muslim, how do you think belonging to those 3 communities has changed your experiences as you've been campaigning and educating and writing?
I think for me, it's been very interesting. One of the most interesting aspects of it, I'm not quite sure where to place it, is being that loud, angry Black woman. It's a massive stereotype. And it's like, actually, we face a lot of oppression. I should be upset all the time, and that would be allowed. But it's not, because racism and misogyny, misogynoir, in fact. And so when I converted to Islam and I started to wear hijab, I was immediately read as Arab, and I still am in many cases. And then it became, how brave of you to speak up. Wow. And it's like, take my hijab off, I'm in an afro. Why are you so mad? Hijab on. You're so brave. And that was a bizarre thing for me, to look at the different dynamics of oppression, because it's not, oh, hey, racism's coming in clutch, because that's never the case. It's never convenient. Even if you want to put like kind of a silver lining on it, it's just looking at the way it morphs to the politics at present, and becoming this Rorschach test for oppressive forces, where they saw whatever they wanted to see in me in order to apply their racialization, those social reproductions of race and Islamophobia and sexism. That was very interesting. But so many other dynamics are at play as well. I think the beautiful thing from it is that I have so many interconnecting communities. I've grown so much in my own understanding of myself, my understanding of like what it means to really coalition build. Because even when I come and speak on campus, for example, I'll have a Muslim Student Association, the LGBTQ+ Association, and the Black Student Union all come together to invite me on campus. And sometimes it'll be an event like that happening on campus where those coalitions are actually meeting with one another. But when I first started doing talks, the Black Student Union wouldn't get invited, or the Muslim Student Association wouldn't get invited. And I had to recognize how even within myself, there's this alleged conflict. I'm very content with who I am. I know who I am. I wake up, I go to sleep, I know who I am. But it's sometimes about explaining that to the rest of the world. And that takes a level of like resilience and fighting of exhaustion and caffeine, to be quite frank. But it's been an interesting process because it's not that I don't know who I am and I have to explain it. It's that you don't know who I am. And perhaps you haven't invited me to make that clear to you. So let me say that clear for myself. And I think that's a beautiful growth process because the narrative is often the reverse.
Thank you so much. I'd like to move and make time for audience questions. Is there anybody in the audience that would like to ask? We'll start with the gentleman on the right. If you could stand up when you ask your question. Thank you.
Thank you for coming. I've really enjoyed your talk. I have a couple of questions. The first one is, you said about intersectionality and mixed race people. You know, before they're called mulattoes, they're called half castes, etc. And I feel like when you said about the fact that racism and race itself is an invention, do you feel that it's almost become so universally accepted that mixed race people still have the case where they're sometimes too black for white people, too white for black people, or not white enough, not black enough? And if so, what would you say to mixed race people?
Thank you for your question. I struggled with this as well. And actually, it was Dr. Angela Davis. I asked her a very similar question. And she told me that black is a political identity. No one can take that from you. And I was like, awesome, radical. Did I completely absorb what that meant? Not at the time. But what it means to me now is, like I was saying, the politics of who you are. We know who we are, generally. And it is sometimes that step of explaining to others who we are, or coming into a space and telling others, hey, this is who I am, and someone saying, no, you're not. And then you having to deal with that cognitive dissonance of, okay, these 10 people are telling me this is not who I am, but I know myself to be this. What does that mean? And sometimes it takes, I feel, not just building that self-esteem, but putting that into the context of systems of oppression and really saying, why is this? Because say, for example, my mother is very fair-skinned. She, like, phenotypically, as much as that is a thing, would be racialized as white. Her father is black. And so sometimes I'll encounter people who are very intent on saying that my mother is white. And it feels very much like an attack because it's like, first of all, that's not true. You're deciding something, and it is very antagonistic. And what I've had to do is take a step back and say, these people do not know her. They're basing their assumptions on who she is, on the assumptions of people that they didn't even meet, on these long-dead European men. So why are we doing this violence to one another? Because it's particularly insidious. Racism is horrible. But then to do racism in a way that you're denying people, or racialization rather, which is the application of categories based on race, to do racialization in a way where you're denying somebody's space is difficult. Because on the one hand, it can be a security mechanism. It can say, I'm trying to keep ourselves safe. We don't want to give you access to infiltrate this space. But at the same time, how dare you deny me not only my truth, but my truth because I am trying to be in community with you. And then, of course, we get people who are feigning racialization. Like, I won't name their names because they don't deserve any more airtime than they get, that make it more difficult. And so it's this simultaneous act of realizing that it's not your fault, right? That that I don't bring race into things. Race was brought into this for the past 600 years. I just got here, one. But then also having, I think, sometimes grace and forgiveness, as much as that's difficult, or at least understanding if you can't get to the place of forgiveness, to recognize where it comes from and to have that patience. Because the fact is, as a lighter-skinned Black woman, as a beneficiary of colorism, I'm going to have people who don't trust me because of what color I am. That's not my fault, but it is my responsibility to be aware of and to not participate. I think that goes with any, privileged person, to be aware of it, to not get caught up in whose fault it is, but to be so intent on dismantling that, not to use your privilege for good, but to, one of my students said it best, that privileged people cannot win the fight of oppression. We have to lose in order for oppressed people to win. And I think that's what's really important, is to look at that and to look at yourself not as an individual who's being attacked in a system, but as somebody who's a casualty of this greater institution. And then for me, at least, it feels like the blow is softened because it's spread out. And then I can really take a stock and say, this is a larger issue. How can we attack that instead of me feeling attacked by myself? I hope that's helpful.
And just my other question, if you don't mind, was you mentioned Black Lives Matter last year, and it felt like a lot more people were listening, but who perhaps had never listened before. But do you feel that the movement, in a sense, missed an opportunity by focusing more on symbols and statues than on real-life inequalities, such as healthcare, such as housing, etc., etc.?
That's an excellent question. I think it's really interconnected. And I think that there's a version of me at one point, maybe a couple of years ago, who felt as though that was a big dissonance. But it's so connected. In New Orleans, for example, there's a statue of a Confederate general with a horse, and the horse was standing on the neck of a Native American person. That's psychological violence at all times. And we have to be very aware of what that means. Because, say, for example, in the United States, Black and racialized communities are more likely to have hypertension. It's not because our hearts are worse. In fact, a couple hundred years ago, we had superior physiques, which made us better for enslavement. But now it's that we're so defective. It's about the politics of it. And so when we look at those things, is it because microaggressions are inconvenient? Or is it because your blood pressure is spiking because every time you walk past a white woman who grabs her purse, you know that that could be between you and getting shot by a police officer? It's relative, it's connected. And so that psychological violence is very much connected. So I feel as though, especially in the United States, where like healthcare is not a guarantee by any means, looking at the symbolism directly connects, because it is those institutions that connect to the interpersonal actions, that connect to the intrapersonal ideas. And those intrapersonal ideas are about superiority and inferiority. If you're driving past something every day, for example, these horrible mascots on so many American teams that have indigenous people and caricatures of them, can you objectively say that you're looking at a caricature of an indigenous person every single day and then humanizing them the same as everyone else? Because you've been taught not to. And it's going to take a lot more work for you to learn that humanity when your baseline is dehumanization. And then we get things like roads not being paved on native land, on less than 2% land in the United States being held by Native Americans, by indigenous people. These things are so intimately connected. And even things like the pandemic, as soon as it became aware that pre-existing health conditions were something that would make somebody more susceptible to COVID-19, suddenly, oh, well then, that's not us. And the people in power became less concerned, because it is all this ecosystem. We cannot have something that is tantamount to glorifying enslavement. Or even people like George Washington, people like Abraham Lincoln, who I did a Smarter in Seconds on about being racist. I highly recommend it. We don't get to a place where we can have an objective look at things like the police state if we are still putting people on money like Andrew Jackson, who are so absolutely horrid, to contributing to all types of systems of oppression, because it teaches us subconsciously and overtly that these people are worthy of esteem and honor and praise, regardless of who they harmed. And the systems that they built are still harming us.
And time for one more question. If we take the gentleman in the front.
Hi, and thank you very much for that. I found it very interesting. My question is sort of, I suppose, about how we view different types of racism, both in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and across the world. The history you gave of the sort of invention of race focused probably naturally on the United States and the laws passed over there. But obviously the United Kingdom's problems with institutional racism have been sort of different in terms of 50s and 60s, 70s, much more aimed at South Asian people. Do you think that across the world and within the UK and the US, we need to treat anti-Black racism differently to how we treat anti-Semitism or racism against Hispanic people or Native American Indians or South Asian, East Asian people, because of the more complicated, perhaps more extreme history? Yeah, that's my question. Really.
Thank you. It's a great question. So yes, whether we look at things differently, I think that I default to looking at the interconnectedness of it. And I think, Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw for giving wisdom with intersectionality about that. Because if we look at things like anti-Semitism, for example, we can see that when Columbus was given the money in 1492 to go and pillage, India, North America, it was the same time as the people who became the Sephardic Jews, I believe, were expelled from Spain and Portugal. those things are inextricably linked. But also when we look at indigeneity, we have to look at, yes, South Asia, parts of, South Asia and the islands, as well as Africa, as well as the United States, and understand that even in the United States, we neglect to discuss African people as indigenous to Africa. We only discuss indigenous people as it relates to people who are indigenous to Turtle Island, not even folks who are in South America either. And so the things are so interconnected. And of course, a virus is going to hit differently, and this virus being racism is going to hit differently in different places based on the underlying culture, and because it is so extremely tailored to fit each specific instance. So I think it requires precision. As far as like ranking it or looking at these different things, I find it immensely harmful when things are co-opted. But I think that sometimes there's a confusion between co-opting something, which is stealing without crediting or using it for specific ends while ignoring the origins, appropriating, and seeing what best practices are. I think sharing best practices is an immense way to get work done, group study. But if you're doing a group study and the person who's helping you get the answers right and wrong is being left out of that advanced movement, that's a problem. And I see that a lot with Black Lives Matter, particularly as it relates to the discussions I've had with my best friend, Ren, about fighting Asian hate. One of the first things we saw when this kind of more conscious raising around anti-Asian hate in February of this year, of 2021, we would drive down through Koreatown and see billboards that said "Stop Asian Hate." And one of the conversations Ren and I had was Ren told me, I don't see ones about Black Lives Matter. And then we had a conversation about how resources are allocated, who owns what, why. And that it's not necessarily even it's literally not productive to have a conversation about which marginalized person has more when there is a system of white supremacy holding all of us down. I think that's the difference, is to have a common understanding of what that target is. But as far as the ways that we fight it and learning the ways that it's weaponized against us is so necessary. Because when I took my History of South Asia class, I was very arrogant in thinking that, I will just apply my knowledge of, North American, racism and apply it to partition. Segregation and partition have similarities, but they are different. And that difference is necessary because you can't solve a problem, you can't reverse solve a problem when the numbers to start out with were different or when the context were different. And so I think the precision is necessary. But I also think that there's a reluctance to be precise because there's such an emphasis on things like what Munir said, that Black people experience less pain or less sensitivity. So our issues must be less serious. It must be possible that somebody who is a liberal white student can come in and solve Black Lives Matter issues. Saw this so much last year. I have an idea for the NAACP. Can you pass it on? I don't know them. And also they've been around for 100 years. You've been around for 12. What is this? And it's not to dismiss people from innovating, but to have a reverence for the context that people are facing and the complexity of these issues, and to have the humility and the sense of, I call it arrogance when I thought that partition would be the same as segregation, because it was arrogance. I must know this. This is remotely similar to something I've studied before. That's a great place to start, but you must also have that step of, very American of me. Let me take a step back and actually look at this dynamic. Because it will be different, because the peoples are different, and not because they are lesser, but because it is different. And to hold that sacredness and then apply the best practices. And that's how you get coalition building. But you can never come into a situation as it relates to racism or anti-oppression or intersectionality and assume that you have everything to teach and nothing to learn. That's colonization. That's saviorism. You have to be very integrated into the entire process and say, I might have some thoughts, I might have some resources, but let me sit back and expect that I will also learn as I sit here as well.
Very, very brief.
Thank you very much for that. I think very interesting answer. I agree with it. One thing that sort of struck me when you were saying that I'd never really thought of at all before you mentioned it was how the language of white supremacy could affect how we see minority ethnic groups who are white. So in the context of the whole world, Jewish minorities, and also more in Europe, Roma Gypsy groups who suffer from racial oppression, but don't fall necessarily under the category of being non-white. And we had this discussion in college when it was realized that the description of our ethnic minorities representative directly referred to sort of non-white students. Do you think that using the language of white superiority, white suppression, white oppression, can ignore necessarily the plight of those, but do you think it is still a helpful term to be used in discussions about race and oppression?
That's a great question. Thank you. I think that the language is always evolving, and the reason for that is because the people who have been kept out and who have been directly affected are getting access by any means necessary, and then going, this doesn't work, and starting to change it. I mean, for example, BIPOC has become a term that's used often, Black, Indigenous, and or people of color. I've been saying racialized, but it's also important, as my partner Akeem pointed out, who studies national security as well as white supremacy generally, that whiteness is racialized. But the way that it's racialized is that it's not named. So what we get is British. And then we have British Indian, or as I was filling out my NHS form, all these different layers that we don't have in the States. And so that's how it's racialized. And so when I say racialized groups, but I'm specifically not referring to white people, it's because we must undo that system of oppression by naming the people that are unnamed who get to go covert and under the radar. I think that we have to shift language like Western. That makes no sense. The Western world, the Mideast. We have to be geographically specific as we're talking about, North Africa, South Asia, the Swana region, talking about Europe and European colonialism. And that's necessary because we have people like the Irish who are not colonizing people in Europe, but wouldn't necessarily be referred to as indigenous because when that colonization happened, it wasn't when indigeneity became part of the construct of race. So I think specificity is necessary, but also the historical context, because I find it so terribly frustrating when people come out, this is the term we're using. If you're not using it, you're racist, you're not woke, instead of being like, why? Why are we using it? And I think that gets back to my point earlier about it doesn't cheapen the thing when you create the specificity and the understanding. Because if we just change the language around oppression and we don't actually change the conditions, we're going to be spinning in that same circle and repeating the things that Margaret Halsey said in Colorblind. And I never thought I would cite her book in a talk, but it's really necessary to look at the dynamics and how so few things change when we dance around it and use different language around it instead of actually examining it and dismantling it in the process. Thank you.
I wish we had time for more, but we'll finish with one final question that we've asked all of our speakers. If you could bottle everything you've learned and seen and your experiences into one thing for our members to take away, what would that be?
Oh my goodness. It would be that learning is a blessing, which is also kind of my catchphrase. But I think that so often we treat learning or the accumulation of knowledge as this grave undertaking, and it can be, particularly when it's in the pursuit of degrees or advancement, but it's also so deeply exciting because we have the ability to learn something new every day. Literally the most inane things. Like, I've been walking around campus and taking pictures of like the manhole covers because I want to know where those came from. Why were they shaped that way? Why aren't they shaped that way anymore? Because it's so exciting to just be so in touch with our world. And I truly treat every day like it's a holiday because I had a history teacher in 3rd grade. He's a substitute teacher, Mr. Foray, and he would read the magazine to us, and he was rarely on campus. He was a substitute teacher, and he would say, today is, Monday, June 7th, 2021. It is the only Monday, June 7th, 2021 that will ever exist. So if you wanted to do something on this day that you can't do on any other date, you should do it. Of course, that's the Gregorian calendar, so you might have some, And I think that's just a really exciting way to live because it just makes this infinite possibility. And sometimes, maybe June 8th, you want to sleep the whole day. Do that. That was your sleep day. But really giving everyday meaning and excitement really grounds me in the purpose. And I think particularly as a historian, because I deal with dates so often, it makes things that much more exciting.
Blair, it's been such an honor to host you. I hope you've all had as good an evening as I have. Please join me in thanking Blair Imani.